Multi-hazards, all about communities.
To change the world first requires us to understand the nature of society, to look seriously at the way that it is structured. Racism, white supremacy, is the most important feature of this global system, and black and brown people suffer the most worldwide. The reality of it all is that capitalism continues its ruthless quest to dominate, accumulate, spread across the world, and strip resources. This is also the source of today's environmental crisis. If the West keeps carrying on in this way, this would literally mean the end of the entire world. This is the most urgent issue for all of us. Something drastically needs to change. Can we get the buy-in necessary for everybody to make real change? Listen to Dr. Kehinde Andrews as he spells out how racism and colonialism are still ruling the world in Empire 2.0. Hello, dear listeners. Today we feature a wonderful conversation with Dr. Kehinde Andrews. But first, let's give a territorial acknowledgement. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Stalo, aka Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katsi, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Kwikwetlam peoples. These are the names of the excellent First Nations groups who have inhabited this land since time immemorial. This area near me, also known as Greater Vancouver, here on the west coast of Canada. So my guest for today is Dr. Kehinde Andrews. Kehinde Andrews is professor of Black Studies at Birmingham City University, where he founded and is currently director of the Center for Critical Social Research. At BCU, he was also one of the team who founded the first undergraduate degree in Black Studies. Andrews regularly writes for The Guardian, The Independent, Ebony Magazine, and CNN. He has been featured on Good Morning Britain, Newsnight, Channel 4 News, BBC News Channel, and Under the Skin with Russell Brand. Andrews' first book, Resisting Racism, Race, Inequality, and the Black Supplementary School Movement, was published in 2013, and he co-edited the first collection of British Black Studies, Blackness in Britain, in 2016. He also wrote Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century, published by Zed Books in 2018. And in this podcast episode, we discuss his latest book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World, published in 2021 by Bold Type Books. Kehinde Andrews lives in Birmingham, United Kingdom. All right, you're in for a great conversation today. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. So hello, it's the Multi-Hazards podcast back again. And today we have special guest, Dr. Kehinde Andrews, and we discuss his recently published book, The New Age of Empire, How Racism and Colonialism Still Rule the World. So hi, Kehinde. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Happy to be here.
Okay, great. Now, we've all been going through this heavy global pandemic. It's been going on for a year and a half. And where I live, we're in the fourth wave, and it's a little bit scarier as it goes along. So I'm just wondering, how have you and the people around you been coping with the pandemic?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been interesting. I mean, me personally, I'm okay, right? I've got a decent house, kids, garden. I'm all right. I got a job that paid me my full wage the whole time through. So I can't personally really complain. I mean, we've been impacted. So Black and minority ethnic people are more likely to die from COVID. Same across the pond as well, I gather. And I have had a couple of family members who've passed away. So there's personal tragedy, and we've seen a lot of that. And also a number of our students, we teach Black Studies. A number of our students had a lot of personal tragedy as well. So it's been hasn't been the easiest. But again, my own personal situation, is better than most, I would imagine.
Right, right. Yeah, I know it's been a very heavy time for many people. Now, these two books here that you've written, where we were talking today about the new age of empire, but I had to go back. I think I was listening to a podcast, and in it you had said that the previous one from 2018, so new age is new age of empire, that's I think earlier this year, right?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so and you have done a lot of YouTube interviews and webinars and podcasts. It's been amazing. And then the one that was really eye-opening was Back to Black, Retelling Black Radicalism for the 21st Century. And I can see how they fit together.
Yeah, so the two books really are related. Back to Black, I wrote first, but really is the sequel, if you like, to the New Age of Empire. And Back to Black is my favorite, probably the best thing I ever write. Honestly, like that is the what is Black radical politics and what does it mean?
Right. And I'm just wondering, how has your background and politics developed in Birmingham, United Kingdom, there where you have grown up with your family?
So I was fortunate enough to grow up in the British Black Power movement, which is really underplayed historically. It's like it didn't exist, but like my family were part of starting the Harambee organization. I currently lead the Harambee organization of Black Unity, Black bookshops. There was what we call Saturday schools, this idea of self-reliance. So I grew up with these radical books, Malcolm, the Black Panthers, Angela Davis, Claudia Jones. That was just my library growing up, right? So I for me, that kind of talk about Black politics is just normal. It's like it is the canon for me. Obviously, most people don't have that privilege, and so that's what's really influenced my life, my politics, my work, and led to both of these books, I would say.
Right, and I heard the story that you were like a teenager and you were reading that book. I think it's called Stokely Speaks.
Stokely Carmichael, Stokely Speaks. Yeah.
Okay, right. And then you quoted Malcolm X. You said it's like snow falling off a roof.
Yeah, no, that book was I actually only picked up Stokely Speaks, which was one of Stokely Carmichael's books, and he later became Kwame Ture. I only really picked that up because the front cover is ridiculous. Like he's got his little afro and his big glasses and he's holding a shotgun above his head. And I thought it'd be amusing to read. But honestly, I read that book and I can't even remember what it was about it, but it completely transformed everything. It was like Malcolm X said when he was in prison, reading is like snow falling off a roof. It's that sudden. And, before then I'd been kind of rejecting my parents, my dad in particular. And then that book just kind of changed everything and led me on a path to where I am now, I would say.
Right. So when you had finished Back to Black, I guess it was obviously before 2018 that you probably finished it and then you published it 2018, but then you felt the need to write The New Age of Empire, which has been getting a lot of press. So I'm just wondering, what was the motivation there?
So Back to Black is what do we do? How do we organize? What do we need to do politically going forward? And I spent a lot of time going around talking to people, getting feedback. And it was very clear from that people first needed to understand the scale of the problem to understand that this is the solution that we need, right? So Back to Black is revolutionary, it's radical, we need to overturn the system. But it was very clear that people didn't understand that racism is our political and economic system. You cannot separate the two. You cannot reform out racism. And so that's what the New Age of Empire is. I tried to kind of forensically analyze it and just say, look, this is what it is. So actually, New Age of Empire is pretty bleak in terms of its thesis, which is the world's racist. It's not going to change. White supremacy is what it is. And it's in all of our institutions, all of our interactions, which sounds pessimistic. But when you put it with Back to Black, it's actually not. It's deeply optimistic because the whole point of the argument is to say, look, we can do something else. We can imagine the world radically differently. We just need to stop getting stuck in this idea that we can fix a system that, to be honest, isn't broken. It does what it's supposed to do, right?
Right. And to me, I read Back to Black is more like specific, but New Age of Empire is kind of like a global, it's like a universal view of the problem, right?
Yeah, they're both Black. So I teach Black Studies, my professor of Black Studies, and both books are deeply Black Studies. Back to Black is, in fact, when I pitched Back to Black to, I won't say the publisher, but a well-known trade publisher, they liked it, but they said it's too Black. so we can't take it, right? And it is too black, so I took it as a compliment because it's a very, very black book, right? The New Age of Empire is just as black, but it's taking that analysis and then taking it globally. So I think I mentioned almost all the countries in the world. There's a bit on India, there's Africa's in there, obviously, Caribbean, Americas, and it's essentially the black radical view of how we understand the world, basically.
Right, exactly. Now, this message was actually not new to me because I've been reading and talking and listening to a lot of people from indigenous perspectives, but you've taken it's kind of a similar worldview and put it in the black perspective. So I found it really refreshing. Now, just getting really basic here. I saw on Twitter you were, it's not really debating. I forget what the name of the fellow was, Clive Robinson or Clive Robbins.
Oh, Calvin Robinson.
Okay. And basically on the definition of racism 101. And just that little exchange got me doing some more research. And I found out that after all these years, I've got it wrong. And just to illustrate it with a story, I have somebody I know who's American living in Canada. And so we were talking about these two books. And then he said, well, you know, as an American in Canada, I get discrimination all the time. Like I'll be in the lunchroom and people are saying all kinds of bad things about Americans, how we're crazy and how we're this and how we're that, and how Canadians are so sane and everything. And they don't realize that I'm American. They just think I'm one of them. And I feel really hurt, you know, every time I hear people doing that. And I was trying to think, how am I going to respond to it? This is not the same. It is really not the same. That little exchange with the fellow there on Twitter, that kind of opened it. So I'm just wondering if you could explain to us, like, well, what is racism and how does it differ from, say, ethnic discrimination?
Yeah, no, but that example is a perfect one, right? Where what we've essentially done with racism is we've defined it as being individual prejudice based on skin color, right? So people don't like me because I'm black, therefore that's racism. It's actually not what racism is. So prejudice and racism are different things. Racism is privilege plus power, is somehow the way that some people put it. But basically, the way I think about racism is it's about the structure, it's about the institutions, it's about life chances. It's a matter of life and death, right? Being black means you are more likely to die. It is that simple. And it's that simple here. It's that simple in Canada. It's that simple in Africa. It's that simple anywhere black people are. It isn't about the petty insults, etc. And if you look at what's been done over the last 50 years, really all the legislation has done has tried to outlaw prejudice. So whereas my mom's generation, my mom got called the N-word all the time. Every time she went out of the house, she was called the N-word. I only really know the N-word from hip-hop. I've been called the N-word like once or twice in my whole life, right? And negatively. So what we've done is we've outlawed that. We've tried to do like bias training and all these things, but that's never been the problem. The problem isn't prejudice. The problem is the system which allows that prejudice to exist. The example I usually give for this, actually, I'll take a US example because I think a US example is a good one. Let's take lynchings, right? So lynchings, the fact that a group of white people don't like black people, that's individual prejudice. They decide we're going to go and kill a black person, we're going to lynch a black man, right? To some extent, you're never going to get rid of it. That's people don't like people. There are lots of reasons people don't like people, right? That's not, I would actually say that's not racism. What makes the lynching racist is that it's allowed, that no one stops you, that you could invite thousands of people to sit down at the barbecue and watch people being lynched, that the police won't charge you, you're not going to prison. The murderers, Emmett Till, got away with it and then made money selling their story afterwards. The system is what's racist, and it enables individual prejudice. But individual prejudice is not racism, right? So there is no comparison to me as a black person saying, look, okay, I'm not saying this, but let's say I hate white people. Well, that's not racist. I have no power behind it. There's no law. In fact, if I go and say that on Twitter, I will be arrested and I will be put in prison, right? So you can't possibly compare that individual prejudice that an American feels or a white person feels and black people don't like them. It's not the same, right? There's no system to enforce it. There's no structural inequality. That's what racism is.
Right, exactly. Now, in the book, actually both books, your main focus is Africa and the Black diaspora. And I'm just wondering how this theme permeates your book and your entire thesis?
So Africa, in terms of Black radicalism, Africa is the place. Like, if you think about Africa is a source of Oz. I can't tell the story of myself without Africa, right? My family at some point was enslaved in the Caribbean. I now find myself in Britain because of that. That tells me about my own history, but also tells me about my location in the world, right? Africa is really important because if you look at the exploitation of Africa, it's absolutely essential to building capitalism. So it is slavery. Slavery is a foundation stone where the economics come from, where the money and the wealth is to drive industry, et cetera, capital. And that's why we're here. And then there's another shift to African exploitation where it is resources. So now it's not really labor. In fact, the problem you're having in America and in Britain and in the Caribbean and in Canada is we don't need laborers anymore. We're brought here to do labor. There's no work, right? So that's why you're finding so much marginalization. What's happened is the shift to Africa is about resources. Africa is the richest part of the world, bar none. It has all the resources necessary. It's being stripped mined essentially by the West and also China. So Africa has is the home of Black people, right? And also in terms of a revolutionary vision, in terms of Black radicalism, it's always been, if you can unify Africa, if you can have what we call revolutionary Pan-Africanism, because Africa is the only place in the world that literally doesn't need anybody else, right? Like, has the resources, has the food, has the farmland, you could actually take Africa out of the world system in theory. And if you did that, capitalism would collapse overnight because capitalism needs the exploitation of Africa to continue. So Africa has this really important role in radical politics.
Right, exactly. Now, there's this wonderful video you did that was based off of your book, and it was called "Did Colonialism Ever End?" Now, I think that really put it in a nutshell. It was about, I think, 8 minutes. Yeah. And as you were saying, the overt expressions of racism, they seem to have been disappearing over the last few decades, even though we could say in the last 5 years with populism, it's kind of made a little bit of a comeback there. But that the overt racism, it's been outsourced to other countries. So, for example, I was actually preparing for this yesterday, and I was sitting around my living room looking around at all the products and the clothes I'm wearing and the food that is in the kitchen. And I just kept thinking about your thesis that we've basically outsourced the oppression, and we receive it back in the terms of say these products and these things, but I don't see all of the oppression that has happened to get the goods into my kitchen and into my living room. So I don't know if I'm going the wrong direction with this, but I'm just wondering how you see that.
Yeah, so the basic argument of the New Age of Empire is that the logic of colonialism is still with us, right? I mean, put very simply, white supremacy is the idea that Black and brown lives are disposable and exploitable to enrich white life. Right? That's simply what white supremacy is. And if you look at the global economy today, what else could you, honestly, what else could you think? And yeah, where things are produced is the perfect example, right? So the sweatshop labor that allows us to get cheap clothes, etc. The minerals that are literally stolen out of the ground, often by kids in mines in places like Congo, that make this conversation. I mean, the idea that we can have this conversation on laptops and over the internet, etc., is only possible because the commodity prices are so low, because the outright exploitation of African resources, minerals, and also labor to put everything together, right? So everything we have, the prosperity that we have here, is just as dependent on the disposability of Black and brown life as it was during slavery. And if you look at the death rates, you'd see that's the case as well. A child dies every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food and water. All of those children are Black and brown. And that's all because of the way that we have underdeveloped, stripped their resources, exploit their economies. So it looks a bit different today, but it's still basically the same system.
Right. And I saw on the video, there's that chart of the lowest indicators of say health or wealth from all over the world. And it's true that many of the African countries are at the bottom of that scale, right?
Yeah, so I mean, if you actually look at global inequality, Africa, the black place, the so-called sub-Saharan Africa, is the poorest part of the world. Even though it is the richest in minerals, it's the poorest part of the world. Uh, the West, where white people live, is the richest, and then you have this hierarchy in between. We actually have a world created in the image of white supremacy. Yet no one actually talks about, when you talk to things like the UN or talk about all these global crises, no one ever talks about it in racial terms. What else could that possibly be?
Right, exactly. And so basically, the West has drained the other countries. I mean, we're going to talk about in a few moments, like the historical part, but just even currently, the draining has been happening so that we are wealthy and they are not. That's the
Yeah, completely.
process.
Yeah, I mean, in the book, I give a few examples. I mean, I think what's my favorite example is Cadbury's, because they make chocolate. Because I'm from Birmingham, and we have a big Cadbury chocolate factory in Birmingham, and the city is really proud of it because they were quite social reformers, and they built this nice housing for their white workers in Birmingham, etc. But if you look at chocolate production, I mean, you literally can't find a better example of that racial exploitation, where the cocoa farmers are on less than $1.50 a day. The product is cocoa from places like Ghana, stripped out by multinational companies like Cadbury's, taken to Britain, turned into this luxury commodity that the cocoa farmer, I mean, they could never afford, and then sold for like Cadbury's is a 11 billion ton, a massive company, huge company, but its basic product doesn't give any money or resources to Ghana, right? Ghana's just put, and in fact, the Ghanaian president came out just recently and said, "Look, we're not taking this anymore. We can't accept that Swiss chocolate factory companies are just going to keep exploiting from us." The sad thing about that story is he's completely wrong. He has absolutely no power to stop this exploitation, because the way the global economy is and where Ghana fits into the global economy, they haven't got a choice. They have to do this, right? The whole thing is set up so that exploitation will happen and it will continue, unfortunately.
Right. Now, I didn't write this in our notes, but one reason why your thesis really struck a chord with me is that when I was very young, I took a geography course, Canadian geography, and we had a textbook. It was called Heartland, Hinterland. And the other concept they put into it was called core periphery. So basically, the big cities in Canada are the core, and we suck the resources, drain the resources from the periphery or the hinterland. Now, of course, this was just talking about the infrastructure and, for example, the electricity, hydroelectric power. They didn't talk about the people element in that particular course, but your thesis puts the people element right in the center. Am I correct on that?
Excuse me. Yeah, and the terms like core, periphery, there's Emmanuel Wallerstein, who wrote World Systems Analysis, kind of uses those terms and says, actually, yeah, the West is the core and the periphery is the third world, or the underdeveloped countries. And yeah, I guess the argument pushes that a bit further and says, well, they're not just the periphery; they've been turned into the periphery through a process of racism, right? But the basic logic is that, look, these places are expendable, exploitable. You can pace, like, one of the things I do talk about in the book is this obsession that Trump has with bringing back manufacturing jobs, as though the loss of manufacturing jobs in the West, which has been a steep decline of manufacturing jobs, is somehow bad for workers in the West. I mean, that's ridiculous. The reason those jobs left is because the people doing them are now taking starvation wages that would never, ever be acceptable here. And the wealth that produces benefits poor workers here, right? You have welfare state, you have different kinds of jobs, you have sales jobs, etc., etc. But it's this, and this is the problem. We see these things. We're now starting to see these things which are actually more exploitation for the underdeveloped world, as somehow a benefit to them. I mean, it's so irrational, the conversation that we're having about this at the minute, I would say.
Right, exactly. I could just think about in Canada, for example, they've kind of got around these things by hiring temporary foreign workers where they can get a low wage and they can put them in these little tiny houses roomed all together. And then when COVID started, a lot of them got COVID and actually died. And I just thought, well, we were kind of bringing it back from overseas for in that aspect. So, yeah. So Kehinde, you talk about this global white supremacist system, and you say basically, roughly, we could say it's 1492 when it started, and then the end was around the end of World War II. And you talked about during this period, there's the three things: genocide, slavery, and colonialism. And these were the features that built up the West. I'm just wondering if you could briefly just tell us about these three.
Yeah, so prior to the Second World War, I mean, I wouldn't say end, I'd say there's a transition after World War II into the newer form of it. But yeah, genocide, slavery, and colonialism are really those are the defining features of the West. Those are what make the West the West. 1492 is important, obviously, because of genocider in chief, Christopher Columbus, when this bumps into the Americas, which had been around obviously for a long, long time, and deeply developed populations across the whole of the Americas. And the genocide is the first necessary step, right? Because it is the West, and it is, if you think about slavery in terms of gold, silver, those are the two main commodities at first, then becomes things like cotton, sugar, tobacco. Those are the things which give the wealth for everything to happen. And that wealth is generated through the transatlantic slave trade of Africans. But in order to do that, in order to claim this land, which had millions of people on, like not a few people, there were tens of millions of people on this land. The Europeans, led by Christopher Columbus, kicked off the largest genocide in human history. I mean, the estimates are about between 60 and 70 million people wiped off the face of the earth, up to 98% of all the natives in some places just erased. I mean, in Haiti, what's now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which was then what he called Hispaniola, the Spanish called Hispaniola. The midpoint, and this is something that surprised. I have to say, I was surprised by the amount of people who were there, because we're given this idea that it was just a few sparsely populated savages running around eating each other, and that idea is so embedded into our psyche. And even I was a bit surprised to learn that the midpoint estimate, there's higher estimates and lower estimates, but the middle estimate of the amount of natives who lived on Haiti and Dominican Republic was 8 million. It was 8 million, but it's a middle estimate. Right. And from 1492, when he got there, he went back to Spain, came back in 1495, left again in 1512. Just in that period, in that, 10-20 year period, the population is estimated to have declined from 8 million to 20,000 in 20 years. I mean, this is unparalleled, and it's not just there; it's everywhere across the Americas. And that genocide is what opened up the Americas, allowed all this European settlement, and all the way up into Canada and all the way down to Latin America. And without that, and that's why the West is the right term for this, that movement towards the West, you simply don't have capitalism. You don't, because slavery is necessary, and slavery happens in the Americas. And you don't have capitalism. Simply doesn't exist. Colonialism also doesn't exist, because it was that wealth. In 1492, when Columbus sails the ocean blue, Europe is behind. It's behind everywhere. Europe's the only place in the world coming out of a dark age. Europe is really quite backwards if you actually think about it in relation to other places. Only could take the Americas because of largely disease, which they allowed to spread. Biological warfare killed millions and millions and millions, and then they added onto that. Couldn't conquer Africa. Tried to conquer Africa, wanted to conquer Africa, but Africa was too developed, and so they couldn't do that. And it was the wealth from the slave trade, and that economy, and that not the trade itself, but the plantation economy, the gold, all this economy that's produced by it, that allowed the West to accelerate, to really catch up and overtake. And then that allows the West to then colonize somewhere like Africa, go into India, start to colonize. When Britain first goes to India, they can't do anything. They're stuck. The Mughal Empire is way more powerful than Britain. It's only when that declines and Britain manages to pull itself up through mostly slavery that it can compete on the world stage. So though genocide, slavery, and colonialism, absolutely essential to not, and it's not just about esteem and the wealth. The question then is what happens to that wealth, and it's that wealth that leads into the Industrial Revolution, the scientific discoveries, etc., etc., etc. You just simply cannot have any of that industrialization, urbanization, everything that we take for granted about what the West is actual roots of genocide, slavery, and colonialism.
Exactly, and you have really connected the dots well there. That is really important. Now, I gather that you you read a lot of history, and I read a lot of history too. And when you're reading about the genocide, slavery, and colonialism, I mean, it's kind of like reading the script of a horror movie. It's just absolutely atrocious. But then you think about it, that, for example, in Canada, we're talking about the residential schools, and the last one closed in 1996. And then you're thinking, this was not really that long ago, actually. And like my parents and grandparents were alive during when all this happened. And then this whole so-called turnaround, where we've got after World War II, and we've got, all of a sudden, we've got human rights, and we've got United Nations and International Monetary Fund, World Bank. We have this global system. We think that it's all like new and fresh and just chock full of human rights, but it's not. That system from before is there. It's just been, as you said before, it's sort of like a system reboot of a computer, right?
Yeah, if you think about it, it's like the idea that you could ever have universal human rights in a society which is so unequal economically on the basis of race is completely fanciful. I mean, up until World War II, what Europe and America and Canada and the West had done effectively was underdevelop the rest of the world. So there's a point at World War II, at this point, Africa's poor, India's massively been impoverished. The natives in the America, but they're not really there anymore. They're on reservations, and that cultural genocide and certainly reservation schools, that didn't disappear at the Second World War. That carried on. But at this point, you've created the world in the image of white supremacy. So when you're then saying, well, look, everybody has equal rights, that's nonsense. Everybody hasn't got equal rights because everybody hasn't got equal income. So how could you possibly have equal rights with no equal income? This is the problem with the whole rights framework. It's based on Immanuel Kant, who, as you read the book, you'll know he's probably my least favorite of the philosophers, right. Whose moral theory that we all celebrate and still teach in universities, he says himself cannot be separated from his moral geography, which we just call racism, where he believed that Africans were incapable of rationality, didn't deserve full humanity. The white race was the superior race, etc., etc. And so what we have is Kantian rights, and Kantian rights basically say the only right the universal right you're entitled to is the right to life, which gets put around all the time, right? You have some right to self-determination, so we're not just going to kill you. We will stop killing you. We'll stop totally and completely invading you, etc. But in many ways, that's the same rights that we give to animals, right? Like I can say I shouldn't kill gorillas, and I shouldn't enslave gorillas, and I should let gorillas have their habitat. That doesn't mean I believe gorillas are equal to humans, does it? Because we don't. The rights framework that we have has never suggested that Africans and Asians were fully human. It's just suggested they shouldn't be killed, maimed, etc. And that's the problem with you have the UN, the United Nations, which is supposed to look at global equality, supposed to look at the human rights, etc. It doesn't mention this massively obvious racial disparities in terms of life, because as I said before, a child dies every 10 seconds. 9 million people a year die of hunger. I mean, imagine that. Far more people will die every single year than will die from COVID-19 at all. But every year we have a pandemic where 9 million Black and brown people die, and we just accepted that as okay, and we move on and then pretend that we're all about equal rights. So that's not absolute nonsense.
Right, exactly. Now, one thing I didn't really catch before is the whole idea about United Nations, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc. This whole kind of system that deals with the other countries. And you pointed out that it is centered in the United States, whether in New York City or Washington, D.C., right? So the U.S. is really a center of all of this, right?
Yeah. So what happens after the Second World War is the idea of these European empires collapses because, one, they're all poor because they've been fighting each other. Two, you have nationalist movements across the world, and they just say, no, we're not taking this anymore. So you need a new system of imperialism, which isn't as openly brutal because people are no longer accepting it. And it's Malcolm who says that. Malcolm X says it's the best. Malcolm usually says things the best, where he basically says, look, the Europeans were stuck and they did what you do in basketball. basketball. They pass the ball, right? They pass the ball onto America. And America is just Europe on steroids, right? It's the extreme version of Europe. Just loads of Europeans went to a place, committed genocide, and then created this really deeply racist state, right? So America was always destined, if you like, to be the center of empire in many ways. And after the Second World War, the emphasis to do that. And so once the empires are crumbled, you need a new way to manage this system. And, America leads the way. It's not a coincidence that America leads the way. And you get the IMF, the World Bank, the UN. I mean, the UN has the best PR, but it may actually be worse than all of them in some ways. But, there is this, they become the way of managing empire. And we call it globalization, but really it's just empire. It's just empire in a different name. Economics, if you look at the way it happens with like the IMF and the World Bank in particular is if you think about the guarantee you get with the rights framework of independence and nationalism and all this, what happens is that like Britain says, look, okay, Nigeria, you be free, Zimbabwe, whatever. Eventually, Zimbabwe took a lot longer. You be free, but we're going to control your economy. Your economy can't be free. We're going to keep our claws deeply into your economy. And what essentially they do is say, look, we'll have your freedom. And you take a country like Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, actually writes the best book on neo-colonialism called Africa Must Unite. And he says, look, I take over Ghana, got the state, but we've been underdeveloped. There's no schools, there's no hospitals. The only roads lead from the fields to the airport. People are not educated. Our economies are still controlled. All the stuff is still owned by Western nations. How are we ever possibly supposed to succeed? Of course, Ghana's economy is going to fail. There's no possible way it can compete. And so what happens is all these countries end up getting into debt to the West, who's giving them the money, etc. And then they have to go to the IMF and the World Bank, who give them loans, but only on the proviso that they open up their economy, privatization, no state subsidies and all this. And if you actually look at the impact of IMF and World Bank loans, it's disaster. I mean, absolute disaster across the world. And so, and the worst thing about this, and this is what Malcolm calls it benevolent imperialism. It's always sold as development, and we're trying to help you, and we're trying to be your friend. But it's actually more insidious because of that, because people accept it. But it actually is just to be honest, it's just making things far, far worse.
Right. Now, I remember during the pandemic, they showed a map of the world, and they would say, how is COVID spreading throughout the world? And something about Africa just really rattled me. They showed a map of the air flights throughout the world and how it was going. And then they were asking the question, so how come COVID has not been spreading in Africa? And this was last year, mind you. And they were showing that not too many air flights are going in and out of Africa because they're not on the sort of the map, so to speak, for air flights. It's mostly Europe and China and the US. And that kind of made me realize that how underdeveloped Africa is. And I mean, maybe for COVID, it's lucky not to have it spreading like that. But it just shows, like, on the World Transportation Network, like, and you think about human life was started in Africa, but there's Africa. It doesn't have the airports and the air flights.
Yeah, it's a perfect example. I remember I went to Nigeria a couple of years ago, and I was only black people in the airport. Like, you just see like 3 white people. It's like nobody. It is literally family going back and forth, but that's it. And you just see, look, this is a clear example where you can just see these disparities. I mean, the other thing about COVID of why it hasn't had the impact that it's had in places like the West, it's about age. I mean, actually, the life expectancy in Africa is so much lower. There's just not that many old people. Like, it really isn't that many old people. So an illness that, predominantly kills older people is never going to have as much of an impact on a place where there isn't that many old people. And this is often sold as a good thing for Africa. Africa's youngest population in the world. That's because the old people die. Like, because you don't get to a certain age. I remember I did a piece for, I can't remember what it's for, but I did this piece looking at COVID in Africa and South Africa. South Africa is one of the most developed parts of Africa because of apartheid, et cetera, mostly. And I compared Britain to America, Britain's population, which is there's a few more people in Britain, but it's a similar size population as South Africa. And the disparity in ages was insane. Like there's so many fewer over 70s in South Africa. Most of the population's like 30, 35 to 40s, that kind of age. There's hardly any people over 70, and this is over 70. And you shouldn't be celebrating this. This is great, wonderful. That's because people die, right? And I think we've really underestimated that. That's you're right. COVID hasn't impacted Africa because one, it isn't as developed, there's not much travel, and two, there's not anywhere near the amount of old people there should be. It's really a catastrophe, not a good thing that Africa's not been impacted by COVID in that way.
Right. I was teaching a class and I asked my student, I had a few from Africa, and saying, okay, so why are a lot of countries poor? And so quickly, some people said, oh, it's because we have these corrupt leaders who end up in power for many decades and they're just like draining out the resources and sending it to Swiss bank accounts. But then I was thinking, well, how do they get in power? Who's supporting them? Well, like, so I was just wondering, you were saying in the book, I think you put wrote a chapter on it about just the colonial powers. When they left, they said, okay, we have this class of people, and many of them were brought to United Kingdom or to other countries to be trained, sent back, and then they end up in power for a few decades. So I'm wondering if you can say something about that.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things which people always misread about colonialism is colonialism is based on white supremacy, but there is no way that European nations could have controlled like India or most of Africa without elites, without native-born elites. Like there was an elite even before Britain left that was colonial administrators, which were trained in the ways of Britain, etc. All the education system was already British anyway. So there was already this elite who was managing imperialism prior to British exit. And when British left and the Spanish left, etc., those were the ones who were empowered, and they were empowered to do a particular job, right? I always say to students, if you're from an underdeveloped country, the worst thing you could do is come to a Western university to learn development, because you're not learning development, you're learning how to underdevelop your economy. That's the purpose of that education, is what it's doing for your economy. And so when the British left, for example, in large parts of Africa, they were installed, and the people you had who were revolutionary, who were radical, who said, no, let's not do any of this. They were either killed, mostly killed. There's a lot of kills. People like Patrice Lumumba, Chitepo in Zimbabwe, or they were exiled, or they were supported against. And you had these puppet leaders who came up. People like in Congo, it was in Congo had many. Congo. The history of Congo. Geez, if you look at that country, which is still in a civil war, the longest civil war ever, the biggest conflict in terms of death since World War II, which is very, 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 very rarely talk about. Congo is massively rich in wealth, and so when Lumumba is saying, "Look, we're going to take over Pan-Africanism, kick out the French," they just killed him, right? And they said, "We're going to install." First, it was Moise Tshombe. Then it was Mobutu. Mobutu was awful. So you can look at a figure like Mobutu and say, well, look, he's corrupt, definitely corrupt. He stole billions, literally billions of dollars, stole billions of dollars. If you're going to explain why Congo's poor, you'd have to, Mobutu is a massive part of why Congo's poor, but Mobutu didn't do it by himself. That's not possible without the West. Where is this money going? It's going to Swiss bank accounts. It's going to take Concorde rides. He invited over the president. He was friends with the US presidents and the head of the World Bank and all this. There's nothing African about that corruption. This is Western corruption delivered through African people. Trace all that. Go through the Panama Papers and some Angola. Angola came up with the Panama Papers again. They just stealing all this money. Nigeria. Nigeria. There's an example in the book where was President Goodluck Johnson. So this is an old Mobutu's old example. This was like the other day. This was just recently. They had a deal for the oil fields with Shell and Eni, an Italian company, and they basically bribed the government and said, "Well, we'll give you $1.1 billion. $1.1 billion." They sent this money over, and it disappeared the next day. And where did it go? It went to Swiss bank accounts, the offshore accounts in the West. How is that African corruption? That's European and American companies. That's European American currency, and it's going into European and American banks. That's not African corruption? That's just the continuation of the same problem. So you can't. It's a completely the wrong source to look at the corrupt leaders. Obviously, it's a problem, but they're actually a symptom of the bigger problem, which is the fact that the West and increasingly China controls and doesn't control, but it exploits the economy. Those are puppet leaders for white supremacy.
Right, exactly. So I had somebody on my program before, and he was talking about racism and conservatism as Dr. Robert C. Smith. And so he talked about, for example, in the United States, like how racism ends up they get away with racism. It's because of breaking a federal system into small pieces, and you let the small pieces do whatever they want. And those are the states, right? And in Canada, for example, we have a similar system. We have the provinces. Now, Africa, 54 nations, and they all have a vote in the United Nations. But that's the problem, because they're divided into nation states. Then it's kind of the divide and conquer. So I'm wondering what you'd say about that.
Oh, yeah, certainly. I mean, Africa's problem has always been one very, very, very simple problem, is that Africa has never acted as a united force, right? Like, talk about Black consciousness, it's never existed as a political thing in Africa, really, as a unifying force. If Africa had acted as Africa, slavery could simply not have happened. It simply could never have happened. Africa was far too developed, far too strong for Europe as a whole. But when they could deal with individual nations and tribes, they just split it up, and you make deals with that person against that person. It's something we've never, somehow, I'm not sure how we've never learned this, but it's something we've never learned, because that balkanization of Africa, if you look at those 54 countries, they're completely made up. They're all European creations. They're not actually real. They're literally the same drawn on a map with a ruler lines that the Europeans did. I mean, that was the biggest problem for Africa, was accepting the bogus nature of the nation state. It was always going to end badly, because, when you have Congo, when you have like Ghana versus Nigeria versus Congo versus Burundi, and you can deal with those individually, you can exploit the hell out of them. But if Africa was united, and that was the dream of revolutionary Pan-Africanism, you really, really, really couldn't do that. And then just to go to this UN thing, there were people at the time, and this is one of the areas where me and Malcolm X diverge, and it's mostly because of hindsight. Malcolm's around, UN's not Africa. There's people, a lot of people are seeing promise in the UN because you have this one nation, one vote, etc., etc. But 50 years later, we can say that didn't go anywhere. But some people are actually making arguments that the UN would be better because there's more Black and brown countries, right? So you're always going to be able to outvote the white countries because there's more Black and brown countries, but not recognizing that the power is not in the General Assembly. The power is in the Security Council. It's still a white institution with Black faces. The problem is, though, that even now we still haven't got there, and we spend so much investment of time in the UN. Like, it's currently the UN International Decade for People of African Descent, has been since 2015. Nobody knows, and nobody cares. It doesn't mean anything. But people have fought hard for that. We just had there's now a permanent division, something. There's a permanent something being created for people of African descent in the UN, and people are celebrating. A complete nonsense. We were actually wasting our time dealing with this institution, but we have faith in. We basically have way more faith in these because they present themselves as progressive, right? And it's such a big problem for how we go forward politically.
Right, exactly. Now, for example, we're having another Canadian election here, and I keep thinking, after I read your books, I'm kind of not really excited about voting like I was the last election cycle, because you talk about the system, and if you just tweak it here, change it here, just like you were saying about the United Nations, they say, oh, this is the decade of, and it's like, this is just superficial. And Malcolm X was saying, what was that analogy again about the duck and the chicken?
Oh, yeah, this system can no more provide freedom, justice, and equality than a chicken can lay a duck egg. Right? It's just not meant to do it. So let's stop it. Let's stop trying to get something that's impossible.
Right. So I'm just wondering, like, what you're thinking about this, the system, it's basically left in place. We're tweaking it here and there. We have the veneer of change, but the system's still in place, right?
Yeah, completely. I mean, Canada's a good example. We still have the Queen as the head of state, which, I mean, so is in Jamaica, so like 14 other countries. I mean, it's just, that should be an example of what are you doing? Why on earth are we doing this? I mean, I think on the voting thing is interesting though, because you still gotta try and make the best that you can make within that. But I think,
Right.
well, I always vote. I usually vote for the left because hey, life's better, life's marginally better here when you have a left wing government. But we have to stop thinking of that as a solution to anything. It's not. We should do it. We should support. We should try and make conditions as best as we can. But we should also understand that doesn't solve any of the problems that we face.
Right, exactly. Now, but talking about solutions, for example, I know Back to Black, there are a lot of solutions in there. So how do you see Empire 2.0 ending?
Well, it will end. I mean, it definitely everything ends. There's no doubt about it. It will end. And I think, if I'm honest, and the pessimistic part of me is the book. Actually, it said New Age of Empire. The publishers, when I sent the book, they were like, "Can you make it more a bit more of a happy ending?" I was like, I can try, but it actually ended up getting worse because my basic conclusion is, look, this is going to end at some point. And if you look at climate change and look at what's happened recently with the floods and hurricanes, etc., that is accelerating. And one of the this constant wealth and just destroying the planet and destroying the people, etc., we're actually going to kill it. We will actually kill everybody. There is a good chance that the way this ends is with the West ending the world for people. Like that is, if I was going to say what's the likely solution, that's probably what's going to happen, right? Unfortunately, but not to be pessimistic, there are other ways, right? There's always been other avenues once we understand the problem. So, for example, and I give Back to Black gives a very particular Black radical, the unification of African diaspora, revolutionary Pan-Africanism, take Africa out of the world system, which is very Black in one way. But if that actually happens, capitalism has to end. It can't work. So therefore, we're going to have much more bigger solutions. And always the Black radical position has always been the position that said, well, actually, let's make connections with Asia. Let's make connections with indigenous peoples. Let's make connections across the board. Let's make connections with poor whites. Actually, it's always been Pan-Africanism has been there, and Black radicalism has been really keen on doing that. And so, yeah, it's what I would always stress to people is it's possible. The system will end. The question is, how will it end, and what will we do, and what will we create differently? And the biggest thing that is against us now, and this is why I wrote the books, is we've been convinced that this is it, that there's nothing else, that there's no other solution. And we need to shake that out of our heads immediately, because 50 years ago when Malcolm X was talking about revolution, it was possible. Like the West was very, very much in peril. You had communism, you had Pan-Africanism, you had all these movements internally, and that's why there was so much violence, and also why we got bought up. That's why we have racial relations acts, why we have civil rights, why you have independence. And the problem is we're still in that period where we somehow have faith in the system. Once we understand the system doing what it's supposed to do, then we can organize and create a different world. But that very much is up to us. It's not just going to happen. And if we leave it like this, we're all going to die in the floods, right? So maybe that's the fire that we need to wake up.
Right. Now you talk about the African diaspora and you give many suggestions. And I know on a local level, let's see, is it called Harambee Society? That
Harambee organization
for many decades. You're involved with that. But I know that you're saying that the African diaspora can do something. Here are some suggestions. And then you also have some concrete local ways that you're doing it. You also have, I believe it's a magazine or the educational arm. It's called Make It Plain. So yes. I know you're trying to do that on a local level. So I'm wondering about the kind of solutions the African diaspora can engage in.
So I was saying before, the biggest problem for African diaspora has been a complete lack of unity. And even in Britain, like the Caribbeans, we even just fight between islands in the Caribbean, which is bad because there are all these little places where none of us should be. So the biggest problem has always been, can you organize the diaspora on the continent? And that, that's a big vision, but it has to start small. You can't just one day wake up and you've got this massive organization. So what we've said is, look, we picked up the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which is what Malcolm X was working on when he died, where he traveled around Africa when they were doing the Organization of African Unity, and said, look, we need to start here. Let's just start here in Harlem. We're going to put together this organization. It essentially works like the government for Black people, where there are different departments around economics, education, health, etc. People pay a membership fee, which is like tax, and you just work together and say, look, what can we do? How do we build? And you build the next one and the next one and the next one. And it sounds fanciful to imagine that that could become a global organization. But the Universal Negro Improvement Association was founded by Marcus and Amy Ashwood Garvey in 1914, started in exactly the same way. And in a few years, it had millions of members across many different countries. The biggest difficulty we have today is that, when the Garvey people went around 100 years ago with no internet, no phone, they almost impossible to imagine had a global organization. Right. But when they went around saying, look, we need to do something else, this system isn't for us, everybody knew, right? Because everybody was in the crap. There was no doubt. Whereas now we've been convinced that there's something for us here. And that's why we started Make It Plain, which is the website make-it-plain.org, where there's different political stuff and ideas and things like that, to kind of show, look, this is no better now than it was then. Because once we understand that and realize that, we'll start to organize, work together. And that has always been the alternative that we can put forward to the world. And I'd also stress on that, as a Black person, because we don't have any organization, we're essentially meaningless to the global struggle against capitalism as Black people, because we have no power, organization, and utility as Black people. So we can talk about allyship and other countries as much as you like, but until we organize ourselves and have some kind of base and power, forget that. So we first have to, so that's always been a big part of Black radicalism, is you first have to deal with that to allow us to actually engage on the world stage, because otherwise it's just talking.
Right, exactly. So I was reading your two books and I kept asking myself, and this is the same feeling I got when I spent so much time with Indigenous people and reading their books and watching the documentaries, and it just kept thinking, like, I want to do something. I don't want to just be on the sidelines. But we see, especially in the last 2 years with Black Lives Matters, they talk about white centeredness, right? And and this can be maybe not just white people, but say globally, could be other people who are not, say, African diaspora or indigenous. So what can the rest of us do, right? And without, being an outside savior or making things white centered.
I think go to Malcolm, because I always go to Malcolm for basically everything. Whereas when they started OAU, he said, look, whites can support us, but they can't join us. This is a Black thing. It has to be a Black thing. And that's a really important part of what we do. There's many ways you can support. Like financially, it's always a big one. Financial support, put the ideas out there is support. So there are ways to support the actual organizations that start and work, etc. And you've seen that, right? People ask for things all the time, right? The other thing would be that Malcolm says a lot, actually, because there's a whole bit in his book, and it's in the autobiography, where a white student comes to him and says, what can I do? And he says nothing, and she runs off crying, and he feels bad about it. He's like, what do you mean? I should have rephrased it. And it's like, what you can do is take the critique, understand what the stakes are, and you need to go organize in the white community. You need to go and say, actually, no, we need something different. And that's the same in China. So for instance, China may well end up being worse than Europe in Africa. We actually look at what China's doing. So it surely is incumbent on Chinese people to stop that and say, well, no, let's not do this, right? Like, we shouldn't be doing this. Why are we allowing China to take this role? And the same way, what I would say is, definitely learn, definitely support when you can. And also, this system's bad for all of us. It's not really good for anybody. And we should all be trying to end it. But the way that happens in other spaces is not for me to decide.
Right, exactly. And I don't know if you've heard of this book called The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. She wrote it in the United States. But her argument basically was saying that the negative effects that happen to Black people in the United States, it doesn't, it wouldn't touch like maybe the richest people there, especially the white people in the US. But there are many other people who are affected who are not in that community. And she tries to make that argument. Now, I don't know. I'm looking back after a few months of reading the book like that, the moral argument, for me, it really grabs my heart. But I don't know if that argument is going to grab a lot of people, right? But as you're saying that if it hurts one group, it is going to have a kind of a trickle down effect. It's going to widen the net, and it's going to hurt a lot of other people, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at what's the nature of the crisis in the West now? It's neoliberalism, right? Everybody's arguing it's neoliberalism, austerity, etc. You really can't explain how neoliberalism hits the West without racism, because it entirely, I mean, actually, everything that you're complaining about happening here, that already happened on the developed world. I mean, that is austerity and all that. That's already been imposed, and that's now coming home to roost in the West, and everybody's complaining about it, right? The other thing about it is it was really racism that voted all of these things in. So in Britain, in particular, because of immigration from the Caribbean, like my family, India, etc., the social settlement with social democracy, which was, we can all benefit, we all share, that collapsed because the right wing were able to say, why do you want to pay taxes for these black and brown people? Why are we supporting immigration? Why are we doing this? And so this individualism you get from neoliberalism is heavily based on the idea that you don't want to share the spoils of empire effectively with black and brown people. You see in America, I'm sure you see it in Canada. So racism actually explains what's happening here and explains the crisis. Because without racism, these things don't happen. We just had Brexit in the UK. We had one of the most right-wing governments ever in the UK, but certainly in my lifetime. And their policies for white poor people are horrendous. I mean, these are the problems. They're horrendous. But they got voted in because the loads of people are racist. Right? And they say, yeah, we don't want immigration, right. We don't want this, and have now left themselves open to further being exploited, etc. So really, if an honest analysis of this would suggest that, the interest of many, I'd always talk about black stuff. I'm always arguing for black communities, but there is a wider impact here, which is affecting many people who aren't black at all.
Right. Now, I'm wondering, do you have one last message that you would like to leave ringing in the ears of the audience here?
I mean, revolution is possible, and so this is why I say the sequels. The catchphrase for Back to Black was "revolution is possible." We have to believe that there is something else possible. The most pessimistic view is the one I hear all the time, where people. I always ask this when I go to groups, like, hands up if you think that racism can end in capitalism, and like one person out of 100 will put their hand up. So everybody understands on some level that racism is a permanent feature of this. But then when you say, well, look, let's do something else, everyone's, we can't. The best we can do is reform it. That's pessimism. That's the absolute pessimism. This is the best that we can hope for. Revolution is possible. It is a possible thing to do. And then the message of the New Age of Empire is really the revolution is necessary. So we have to understand we have to pull back from the brink. And it's not, as I said, it's not just for us. Capitalism is going to destroy the world for human beings if it carries on. And even look at what these super rich people are doing. When, what's his name? Jeff Bezos, who has all this money, where's his focus? It's not on trying to fix the world. They've already left. They're building rockets and we're going to colonize space. They've given up. They know they've destroyed the world, and they'll be fine because they'll be living on the moon, and you'll be drowned. Right? So actually, that's the message. This isn't just about black people. This is about all of us. We radically need to alter how we are in the world, because, like I said, the world is going to end for all of us if we don't.
Right, exactly. So the very important message, and I thank you so much, Kehinde, for coming to the podcast today. And I hope you have a wonderful week and weekend. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you. I enjoyed that.
Okay, take care. And that's it. This was a very eye-opening conversation. Thanks to our awesome guest, Dr. Kehinde Andrews, for joining us here today at the Multi-Hazards podcast. And an important disclaimer here. First, this podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific professional or expert advice unless otherwise noted. Second, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that either my guests or I are working with. So, here as I conclude this episode, thanks to all of you, my precious, awesome listeners, for joining us here today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more episodes. This is Vin Nelson, wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.